Joseph was a young boy, the son of Jacob, and he had 11 brothers. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, and he gave Joseph a special gift, a beautiful coat of many colors. Joseph wore the coat with pride, but his brothers became jealous of him. They didn't like how their father treated Joseph better than them, and it made them angry. One night, Joseph had a strange dream. He dreamed that he and his brothers were out in the field, tying bundles of wheat. Suddenly, Joseph's bundle stood tall, and all of his brothers' bundles bowed down to his. Joseph excitedly told his brothers about the dream, but it only made them angrier. "Do you think you will rule over us?" they asked. Later, Joseph had another dream. This time, he dreamed that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. When Joseph told his father and brothers about this dream, even his father was surprised. "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I, along with your brothers, really bow down to you?" Jacob asked. Although Jacob was puzzled, he kept Joseph's dream in mind. Joseph's dreams were not just regular dreams, they were special messages from God about his future. But Joseph's brothers didn't understand this. Their jealousy grew, and they began to think of ways to get rid of Joseph. They couldn't stand the idea of their younger brother being more important than them. One day, Joseph's brothers were tending their sheep far away from home. Jacob, their father, asked Joseph to go check on them and bring back news of how they were doing. Joseph set off, wearing his colorful coat, and traveled a long way to find his brothers. When his brothers saw him coming from a distance, they recognized him by his coat and began to plot against him. "Here comes that dreamer," one of the brothers said. "Let's get rid of him and see what happens to his dreams." They decided to throw Joseph into a deep pit. When Joseph reached them, he was happy to see his brothers, but they grabbed him, took off his colorful coat, and threw him into the pit. Joseph was scared and confused. He didn't know why his brothers were treating him so badly. As they sat down to eat, the brothers saw a group of traders passing by on their way to Egypt. Judah, one of the brothers, had an idea. "Let's not kill Joseph," he said. "Let's sell him to these traders. That way, we won't have his blood on our hands, and we'll make some money." The other brothers agreed, and they sold Joseph to the traders for 20 pieces of silver. The traders took Joseph away to Egypt, far from his home and family. Meanwhile, the brothers took Joseph's colorful coat, dipped it in the blood of a goat, and brought it back to their father. "We found this coat," they said to Jacob. "Is it Joseph's?" Jacob recognized the coat and believed that a wild animal had killed Joseph. He was heartbroken and cried for his son, thinking he would never see him again. The traders took Joseph all the way to Egypt, a foreign land where people spoke a different language and followed different customs. Joseph was scared and didn't know what would happen to him. He missed his family and didn't understand why his brothers had treated him so cruelly. But even though Joseph was in a difficult situation, he trusted that God was with him. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was an important officer who worked for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Joseph was now a servant in Potiphar's house, but he didn't complain. He worked hard and did everything he was asked to do. Joseph trusted that God would take care of him, no matter where he was. Potiphar soon noticed that Joseph was a very good worker. Everything Joseph did turned out well, and Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him. Because of this, Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his entire household. Joseph managed everything for Potiphar, from the other servants to all of Potiphar's possessions. Potiphar trusted Joseph completely, and Joseph worked faithfully, knowing that God was blessing him. Even though Joseph was far from home and had been treated unfairly by his brothers, God had not forgotten him. Joseph's hard work and trust in God made him successful in Potiphar's house. But Joseph's journey was far from over, and soon, he would face another big challenge that would test his faith once again. Joseph was doing well in Potiphar's house, and everything seemed to be going right. But trouble was about to come. Potiphar's wife noticed Joseph because he was strong and handsome. She tried to get Joseph to do something wrong, but Joseph refused. He said, "I cannot do this wicked thing and sin against God." Joseph knew it was important to stay faithful to God and do what was right, no matter the temptation. Potiphar's wife became angry when Joseph refused her. One day, she grabbed Joseph's coat and tried to make him stay with her. But Joseph ran away, leaving his coat behind. Potiphar's wife was furious, so she made up a lie. She told Potiphar that Joseph had tried to harm her. When Potiphar heard her lie, he was very angry, and without asking Joseph for his side of the story, he had Joseph thrown into prison. Joseph hadn't done anything wrong, but now he was in prison, far from the good life he had in Potiphar's house. Even though this was unfair, Joseph didn't lose hope. He trusted that God was still with him, just as he had been all along. Joseph continued to work hard, even in prison, and he stayed faithful to God. God was with Joseph in prison, just as he had been in Potiphar's house. The prison guard noticed that Joseph was different. He saw that Joseph was kind, responsible, and trustworthy, so he put Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. Joseph kept doing his best, believing that God had a plan for him. Even in this dark and lonely place, Joseph had been thrown into prison for something he didn't do, but even in this dark place, he didn't lose hope. He trusted that God was still with him. Joseph made the best of his situation and worked hard, just as he had done in Potiphar's house. The prison guard noticed how responsible Joseph was and put him in charge of the other prisoners. Joseph helped to keep things running smoothly in the prison. One day, 2 new prisoners were brought into the jail. They were the cupbearer and the baker for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Both of these men had made Pharaoh angry, and that's why they had been thrown into prison. Joseph was given the job of looking after them, and he took care of them just as he did for all the other prisoners. After they had been in prison for some time, both the cupbearer and the baker had strange dreams on the same night. They didn't understand what their dreams meant and were very worried. When Joseph saw that they were upset, he asked, "Why do you look so sad today?" They replied, "We both had dreams, but there is no one here to interpret them for us." Joseph, knowing that God could help, said, "Interpreting dreams is God's business. Tell me your dreams, and God will give me the meaning." The cupbearer went first, describing his dream of a vine with 3 branches that blossomed and produced grapes. He saw himself squeezing the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and giving it to him. Joseph listened closely, ready to explain the dream's meaning. After hearing the cupbearer's dream, Joseph smiled and gave him good news. He said, "The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position as his cupbearer. You will once again place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you did before." The cupbearer was overjoyed. But before he left, Joseph made one request. He said, "When you are free and back with Pharaoh, please remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me so that I can get out of this prison. I was taken from my homeland, and I have done nothing to deserve being in this dungeon." Next, the baker saw how well things had gone for the cupbearer, so he eagerly told Joseph his dream. In his dream, the baker was carrying 3 baskets of bread on his head. The top basket was filled with all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds were eating the bread out of the basket. The baker hoped Joseph would have good news for him too, but Joseph's face grew serious. "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days, he explained. "In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree. The birds will eat your flesh." The baker was shocked and scared by this news. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew Joseph was telling the truth. Just as Joseph had said, 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he called for the cupbearer and the baker. Pharaoh restored the cupbearer to his position, and he once again served Pharaoh's cup. But the baker was not so lucky. Pharaoh had him put to death, exactly as Joseph had predicted from the dream. The cupbearer was happy to be free and back in the palace, but sadly, he forgot all about Joseph. He didn't mention Joseph to Pharaoh, and Joseph remained in prison. Even though he was disappointed, Joseph didn't lose hope. He knew that God had a plan for him, even if he didn't understand it at the time. Years passed, and Joseph stayed in the prison, continuing to work hard and trust in God. He didn't know how long he would be there, but he believed that God had not forgotten him. Joseph had faith that everything would happen according to God's perfect timing. Meanwhile, life continued in Egypt, and Pharaoh ruled over the land. But one night, Pharaoh himself had a strange dream. It was so unusual that it woke him up. Pharaoh didn't understand what the dream meant, and he was very troubled. He called for all the wise men and magicians of Egypt to explain the dream, but none of them could. Pharaoh's dream was so strange and troubling that he couldn't stop thinking about it. He called his advisors, magicians, and wise men to help him understand, but none of them could explain the dream. Pharaoh grew more and more worried because he felt that the dream was important. No matter what he did, he couldn't forget about it. In the dream, Pharaoh had seen 7 fat and healthy cows come out of the Nile River. They were grazing on the grass when suddenly, 7 thin and ugly cows came up from the river too. The thin cows ate up the fat cows, but after eating them, the thin cows looked just as skinny and weak as before. Pharaoh woke up feeling confused. Pharaoh fell back asleep and had another dream. This time, he saw 7 heads of grain, full and healthy, growing on a single stalk. Then, 7 thin heads of grain, scorched by the wind, sprouted and swallowed up the healthy heads. Pharaoh woke up again, and this second dream made him even more anxious. He knew the dreams meant something, but he didn't know what. The next day, Pharaoh was still upset. He told his dreams to all the wise men in his kingdom, but no one could explain them. Then, at that moment, the cupbearer suddenly remembered Joseph. He rushed to Pharaoh and said, "Today I remember my shortcomings. There was a young man in prison who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and everything happened just as he said. His name is Joseph." When Pharaoh heard about Joseph from the cupbearer, he immediately sent for him. Joseph was still in prison when the guards came to get him. They cleaned him up, gave him fresh clothes, and brought him to Pharaoh's palace. Joseph was calm, knowing that God was with him and that he had a plan for him. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, the king explained his troubling dreams. Pharaoh said, "I've had dreams that no one can interpret. But I've heard that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph quickly responded, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Joseph was humble and gave all the glory to God. He knew that any wisdom or ability he had came from the Lord. Pharaoh described both of his dreams to Joseph: the 7 fat cows eaten by the 7 skinny cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain swallowed by the thin, scorched ones. Joseph listened carefully, and then God gave him the understanding he needed to explain the dreams. Joseph looked at Pharaoh and said, "Both of your dreams mean the same thing. God is telling you what he is about to do." Joseph continued, "The 7 fat cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain represent 7 years of great abundance. There will be plenty of food in the land of Egypt. But the 7 thin cows and the 7 scorched heads of grain represent 7 years of famine. After the 7 good years, a terrible famine will come. And it will be so bad that everyone will forget about the good years." After explaining Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph didn't stop there. He also gave Pharaoh advice on what to do. Joseph said, "You should find a wise and discerning man to be in charge of the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, have this man collect 1/5 of all the food that is grown and store it away. That way, when the 7 years of famine come, there will be enough food to keep everyone alive." Pharaoh was very impressed with Joseph's wisdom. He could see that Joseph wasn't just a regular man, he was someone filled with the Spirit of God. Pharaoh turned to his officials and said, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Pharaoh knew that Joseph was the right person to help Egypt through the difficult times ahead. So, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as wise and discerning as you. You will be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to obey your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Just like that, Joseph went from being a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph a fine robe, a signet ring, and a chariot. Joseph was now in charge of gathering and storing food during the years of abundance. Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name and even arranged for him to marry an Egyptian woman named Asenath. Joseph's life had completely changed, but through it all, he remained humble and gave glory to God for everything. Joseph got straight to work. During the 7 years of plenty, the land of Egypt produced an abundance of food, just as God had shown in Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph traveled all over Egypt, organizing the storage of grain. He built large storehouses in every city and made sure that a portion of the crops was saved and stored away for the future. He knew that the famine would come, and he wanted to be ready. During these 7 good years, Joseph and Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. Joseph named his first son Manasseh, which means God has made me forget all my troubles and my father's household. It was a reminder that God had helped Joseph through all the pain of his past. His second son was named Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Joseph could see how God had blessed him, even in a foreign land. The years of plenty passed quickly, but Joseph stayed focused. He knew that hard times were coming, and he wanted to make sure that the people of Egypt would have enough food to survive. Thanks to Joseph's careful planning, the storehouses were full, and there was more than enough grain saved for the future. Everyone in Egypt could feel safe knowing that Joseph was in charge. When the 7 years of abundance came to an end, the famine began, just as Joseph had said. The crops stopped growing, and food became scarce. But Joseph wasn't worried. He had followed God's plan. And Egypt was prepared. Soon, people from all over the land began to come to Joseph for food. The famine was severe, but Egypt had plenty because of Joseph's wise leadership. The famine wasn't just in Egypt, it spread to other lands as well, including Canaan, where Joseph's father Jacob and his brothers lived. Jacob and his family were running out of food, and they didn't know what to do. Then Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt. He called his sons and said, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I've heard there's food in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so we may live and not die." Joseph's 10 older brothers set off for Egypt to buy grain, leaving behind their youngest brother, Benjamin, with their father. Benjamin was Jacob's new favorite, ever since he believed that Joseph was dead. Jacob didn't want anything to happen to Benjamin, so he kept him safe at home. The brothers traveled to Egypt, not knowing that the man they would meet was the brother they had sold into slavery so many years ago. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt, they were taken to the place where Joseph was overseeing the sale of grain. They didn't recognize Joseph, who was now dressed as an Egyptian ruler, but Joseph recognized them right away. His heart raced as he saw his brothers for the first time in years. But Joseph didn't reveal who he was just yet. He wanted to test his brothers to see if they had changed. The brothers bowed low before Joseph, just as Joseph had dreamed when he was a boy. They asked for food, explaining that they had come from Canaan because of the famine. Joseph decided to speak to them harshly. "You are spies," he accused them. "You've come to see where our land is unprotected." The brothers were shocked and frightened. "No, my lord," they replied. "We are honest men. We've only come to buy food." Joseph's brothers were frightened by his accusation that they were spies. They quickly began to explain more about their family. "We are 12 brothers," they said, "the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. The youngest is with our father, and one is no more." They didn't realize they were talking about Joseph, the very brother they thought was gone forever. Joseph listened carefully to their words, but he wasn't ready to reveal himself. He wanted to test his brothers to see if they had truly changed. So he said, "I still believe you are spies. To prove you are telling the truth, one of you must stay here in prison while the rest of you go back and bring your youngest brother to me. That will prove that you are not lying." The brothers were terrified. They began to talk among themselves in their own language, not knowing that Joseph could understand them. "Surely we are being punished for what we did to Joseph," they said. "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why this trouble has come upon us." Joseph's heart softened as he heard them speak, and he had to turn away to hide his tears. Joseph chose Simeon to stay behind in prison. He then ordered that his brothers' sacks be filled with grain and secretly instructed his servants to put each man's silver back in his sack. The brothers were sent on their way, not realizing that their money had been returned. They left Egypt feeling guilty and afraid, unsure of what would happen next. As Joseph's brothers were on their way back to Canaan, they stopped for the night to rest. When one of the brothers opened his sack to feed his donkey, he was shocked to find his silver inside. "My silver has been returned," he exclaimed to his brothers. "It's here in my sack." The other brothers quickly checked their sacks and found that all of their silver had been returned. Fear filled their hearts. "What is this that God has done to us?" they asked each other. They were worried that Joseph, the powerful man in Egypt, would think they had stolen the money. They didn't know that Joseph had done this on purpose to test them. Nervously, they continued their journey back to their father, Jacob, in Canaan. When the brothers arrived home, they told Jacob everything that had happened in Egypt. They explained how the man in charge had accused them of being spies and how Simeon had been left behind in prison. They also told Jacob about the demand to bring Benjamin with them on their next trip to prove they were telling the truth. Jacob was deeply upset. He couldn't bear the thought of losing another son. Jacob said, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." The brothers tried to reassure their father, but Jacob was firm. "My son Benjamin will not go down there with you," he said. "His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If anything happens to him, I will die from sorrow." The famine continued to grow worse in Canaan, and soon Jacob and his family were running out of food again. Jacob knew they would have to go back to Egypt to buy more grain, but he still refused to let Benjamin go. Judah, one of the brothers, spoke up. "Father, the man in Egypt warned us that we cannot return unless we bring Benjamin with us. If you send him with us, we will go and buy food, but if you refuse, we cannot go." Jacob was torn. He didn't want to lose another son, but he also knew that they needed food to survive. Judah made a promise to his father. "I will be responsible for Benjamin," Judah said. "If anything happens to him, you can hold me personally accountable. I will bring him back safely." Jacob finally agreed. He said, "If it must be, then do this. Take some of the best products of our land as a gift for the man in Egypt. Take balm, honey, spices, myrrh, nuts, and almonds. And take twice as much silver with you, for perhaps the silver that was returned to your sacks was a mistake. Take your brother Benjamin and go back to the man in Egypt. May God Almighty grant you mercy before him, so that he will let your other brother, Simeon, and Benjamin return." With heavy hearts, the brothers set off for Egypt once again, this time with Benjamin. They didn't know what would happen when they arrived, but they trusted that God would take care of them. Jacob stayed behind, praying that his sons would return safely. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt with Benjamin, they were immediately taken to Joseph's house. They were nervous and confused, unsure of why they were being brought to the home of such an important man. "It's because of the silver that was returned to our sacks," they said to each other. "He thinks we stole it, and now he's going to punish us." As soon as they arrived, they spoke to Joseph's servant at the door. "Please, sir," they said, "we came down here before to buy food, but when we opened our sacks, we found our silver returned to us. We have brought it back, along with more silver to buy more food. We don't know who put our silver back in our sacks." The servant smiled and said, "Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." Then he brought Simeon out to them, the brothers were relieved to see Simeon again and to hear that they weren't in trouble for the silver. The servant then invited them inside and prepared a feast for them. The brothers were surprised by this kindness and even more surprised when they were seated according to their birth order, from oldest to youngest. They couldn't understand how the Egyptians knew so much about them. When Joseph arrived at the house, he saw Benjamin for the first time. His heart was filled with emotion, but he didn't reveal his identity. Instead, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" The brothers nodded. Joseph looked at Benjamin and said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Then Joseph quickly left the room to hide his tears. He was so overwhelmed with emotion that he needed a moment alone. After Joseph had taken a moment to gather his emotions, he returned to the room where his brothers were waiting. He ordered his servants to serve the food. The brothers were amazed when they noticed that Benjamin had been given 5 times as much food as everyone else. They couldn't understand why Benjamin was being treated so specially, but they didn't ask any questions. Joseph watched as his brothers ate and enjoyed the meal. He saw how they interacted with Benjamin, and he noticed that they seemed to care about him. This was very different from how they had treated Joseph when he was younger. Joseph's heart was beginning to soften toward his brothers, but he still wasn't sure if they had truly changed. He decided to test them one more time. The next morning, Joseph gave orders to fill his brothers' sacks with as much grain as they could carry. He also instructed his servants to once again return each man's silver to his sack. But this time, Joseph did something else. He told his steward to place his own silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Joseph wanted to see how his brothers would react if Benjamin was in trouble. The brothers set off for home, thinking everything was fine. They were happy to have Simeon back and relieved that nothing bad had happened. But before they got very far, Joseph's steward caught up with them. "Why have you repaid good with evil?" the steward demanded. "Why have you stolen my master's silver cup?" The brothers were shocked. "We would never do such a thing," they protested. "If any of us is found to have the cup, he will die, and the rest of us will become your slaves." The steward searched each of the brothers' sacks, starting with the oldest and ending with the youngest. The brothers watched anxiously, knowing they were innocent. But when the steward opened Benjamin's sack, there it was, the silver cup. The brothers were horrified. How could this have happened? They tore their clothes in grief, a sign of great sorrow and distress. The brothers quickly returned to the city and went straight to Joseph's house. They threw themselves on the ground before him, begging for mercy. Joseph looked at them sternly and said, "What is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination?" The brothers were speechless. Judah finally spoke up. "What can we say, my lord? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered our guilt. We are now your slaves, all of us." But Joseph had a different plan. He said, "Only the one who was found with the cup will become my slave. The rest of you are free to go back to your father." The brothers were devastated. They couldn't leave Benjamin behind, especially after promising their father they would bring him back safely. They remembered how much it had hurt their father when Joseph was taken from him, and they couldn't bear to cause him more pain. Judah, the brother who had promised to take responsibility for Benjamin, stepped forward. He said, "Please, my lord, let me speak. Our father is an old man. And Benjamin is the only son left from our father's beloved wife. If we return without him, our father will surely die from sorrow. I cannot bear to see the misery that would come upon my father. Let me take Benjamin's place. I will be your slave instead of him. Please, let Benjamin go back with his brothers." Judah's heartfelt plea touched Joseph deeply. He could see that his brothers had changed. They were no longer the same men who had sold him into slavery all those years ago. They now cared about their family and were willing to sacrifice themselves to protect their younger brother. Joseph couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. He sent everyone else out of the room, leaving only himself and his brothers. Then, through his tears, Joseph said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers were stunned. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. This powerful Egyptian ruler was their brother Joseph, the one they had sold into slavery. They were so shocked and afraid that they couldn't even speak. They remembered how they had treated Joseph and feared what he might do to them now, but Joseph didn't want to punish his brothers. Instead, he wanted to comfort them. "Come closer to me," he said. The brothers hesitated but moved closer. Joseph said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. It was God who sent me ahead of you to save lives. For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or harvesting. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." The brothers couldn't believe what they were hearing. Joseph wasn't angry with them, he was forgiving them. They had been so afraid, but now they realized that God had used even their bad decisions for good. Joseph's words brought them comfort, and they began to feel hopeful again. They embraced Joseph, and for the first time in many years, the family was reunited. After revealing himself to his brothers, Joseph was eager to reunite with his father, Jacob. He told his brothers, "Go back to Canaan and tell our father that I am alive and that I am the ruler of all Egypt. Bring him here, along with all of your families, so that you can live near me in the region of Goshen. There will be 5 more years of famine, but I will provide for you and make sure you have everything you need." The brothers were overjoyed by Joseph's generosity. He didn't just forgive them, he wanted to take care of them and their families. Joseph gave them carts and provisions for their journey back to Canaan. He also gave each of his brothers new clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 5 sets of clothes and 300 pieces of silver. Joseph wanted to show his special love for Benjamin, his full brother. As the brothers prepared to leave, Joseph had one more thing to say. He looked at his brothers and said, "Don't quarrel on the way." Joseph knew that they might be tempted to argue about what had happened in the past, but he wanted them to move forward with love and unity. The brothers nodded, grateful for Joseph's forgiveness and eager to make things right with their father. The brothers set off for Canaan, excited to tell their father the incredible news. They had thought Joseph was gone forever, but now they knew he was alive, and not only that. He was in a position to save their entire family from the famine. As they traveled, their hearts were filled with hope and gratitude for how God had worked everything out for good. When Joseph's brothers arrived back in Canaan, they rushed to their father, Jacob. He was anxious to see them, especially since they had taken Benjamin with them. The brothers could hardly contain their excitement as they spoke to their father. "Joseph is still alive," they exclaimed. "He is the ruler of all Egypt." Jacob was stunned. He couldn't believe what they were saying. At first, Jacob didn't know how to react. His heart had been broken many years ago when he thought Joseph was dead. How could this be true? "Joseph is alive?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. His sons nodded eagerly and began to tell him everything that had happened in Egypt. They told him how Joseph had revealed himself and how he was now inviting the entire family to come to Egypt to live. Jacob's heart began to stir with hope. He looked at the carts and supplies that Joseph had sent from Egypt. Slowly, he started to believe the unbelievable news. "My son Joseph is still alive," he said with joy. "I will go and see him before I die." Jacob was filled with happiness and relief. After all these years of thinking Joseph was gone, now he would finally be reunited with his beloved son. Jacob wasted no time. He gathered his family and all their possessions, and they began their journey to Egypt. Although it was a big decision to leave the land of Canaan, Jacob knew that this was the right choice. God had a plan for them, and he had made a way for them to be provided for in the midst of the famine. As Jacob and his family were traveling to Egypt, they stopped at Beersheba, a special place where Jacob's father, Isaac, had worshipped God. That night, God spoke to Jacob in a vision. "Jacob, "Jacob," God called. "Here I am," Jacob replied. God said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go with you to Egypt, and I will bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." Jacob was comforted by God's words. He knew that God was with him and that this journey to Egypt was part of God's plan. Jacob had always trusted in God's promises, and now he saw that God was continuing to guide him and his family. Even in this new chapter of their lives, he knew that everything would be okay because God was in control. With God's assurance, Jacob and his family continued their journey. They traveled with excitement and anticipation, knowing that they were about to see Joseph after so many years apart. As they journeyed, Jacob thought about all the ways God had been faithful to him, from the time he was a young man to now, in his old age. He knew that God would keep his promises, just as he always had. Finally, Jacob and his family reached Egypt. The land was so different from Canaan, but they knew this was where they were supposed to be. Joseph had prepared everything for their arrival, and they were welcomed with open arms. Jacob's heart was full as he looked forward to seeing Joseph again and living out the rest of his days with his family by his side. When Joseph heard that his father, Jacob, had arrived in Egypt, he immediately got into his chariot and went to meet him. Joseph had waited so long for this moment, and his heart was overflowing with emotion. When he saw his father, he ran to him and hugged him tightly. Both Joseph and Jacob cried tears of joy as they embraced, reunited after so many years apart. Jacob held Joseph and said, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." For Jacob, this was the greatest blessing he could have ever received. He had lived for so long thinking Joseph was gone, and now, seeing him alive and well, was more than he could have hoped for. His heart was at peace. Joseph, too, was filled with joy. He had missed his father deeply and had longed for this moment for many years. But now, they were together again, and Joseph was grateful to God for bringing his family back into his life. Joseph introduced his father and brothers to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh welcomed them warmly. Pharaoh offered Jacob and his family the best land in Egypt, the region of Goshen. This land was perfect for them because it had plenty of space for their flocks and herds. Joseph made sure that his family was well taken care of, and they settled into their new home in Egypt. It was a time of great joy and thanksgiving for the whole family. After Jacob and his family settled in the land of Goshen, Joseph wanted to introduce his father to Pharaoh. He knew Pharaoh had been so kind to him and his family, and it was important that his father meet the ruler who had allowed them to live in Egypt. Joseph prepared his father, Jacob, for the visit, and they went together to see Pharaoh in his grand palace. When Jacob entered Pharaoh's presence, he wasn't intimidated by the powerful king. Even though Pharaoh was a great ruler, Jacob was a man of faith who had walked with God for many years. Instead of bowing in fear, Jacob did something unexpected. He blessed Pharaoh. Jacob, an old man, placed his hands together and spoke a special blessing over the king of Egypt. Thanking God for the kindness shown to his family, Pharaoh, though a powerful king, was touched by Jacob's blessing. He asked Jacob, "How old are you?" Jacob replied, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Jacob understood that his life had been filled with both struggles and blessings, but he also knew that God had guided him every step of the way. After the blessing, Pharaoh showed great respect to Jacob. He allowed Joseph's family to continue living in Goshen, the best part of the land, and promised to provide for them during the famine. Jacob returned to his family in Goshen with a grateful heart. Knowing that God had been faithful to him and his family, even through difficult times. He trusted that God would continue to care for them in this new land. While Joseph's family was safe and well-fed in the land of Goshen, the famine continued to spread throughout Egypt and the surrounding nations. People came from all over to buy food from Joseph, who managed the storehouses of grain. Because of Joseph's wisdom and careful planning, Egypt had plenty of food to last through the famine. as the years of famine went on, the people of Egypt found themselves running out of money to buy grain. They came to Joseph and said, "We have no more silver to buy food. Please give us grain so that we may live." Joseph understood their desperation and came up with a plan. He told the people, "If you have no silver, then bring your livestock to me, and I will give you grain in exchange for your animals." The people agreed, and they brought their horses, sheep, goats, and cattle to Joseph in exchange for food. This way, they were able to survive another year. But as the famine dragged on, they found themselves in an even worse situation. The people came to Joseph again and said, "We have nothing left but our bodies and our land. Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." Joseph agreed to the deal. He bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, and the people became servants of Pharaoh. But Joseph didn't leave them hopeless. He gave them seed to plant in the fields when the famine ended and told them they could keep 4/5 of their crops, while 1/5 would belong to Pharaoh. Joseph's leadership saved the lives of many, and the people were grateful for his wisdom. As the famine came to an end, Jacob and his family continued to live in the land of Goshen. They grew in number and became very prosperous, thanks to Joseph's protection and Pharaoh's kindness. But as the years passed, Jacob grew old and knew that his time on earth was coming to an end. He had lived a long and full life, and he was ready to be gathered to his ancestors. Jacob called for Joseph and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, place your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." Jacob longed to be buried in the land of Canaan, where his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham were laid to rest. Joseph promised to do as his father asked, but Jacob wanted to make sure the promise was strong. So he said, "Swear to me." Joseph swore an oath to his father, and Jacob was satisfied. He bowed in worship, leaning on the top of his staff, thanking God for his faithfulness. Even in a foreign land, Jacob's heart was still connected to the promises God had made to his family. Jacob's days were drawing to a close, but before he passed away, he had one more important thing to do. He wanted to bless his children. Just as his father Isaac had blessed him, Jacob wanted to speak a special blessing over each of his sons, giving them guidance and hope for the future. He knew that the blessings he gave would shape the future of his family for generations to come. Before blessing his own sons, Jacob asked to see Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph brought them to his father's bedside. Jacob's eyesight was failing because of his age, but he wanted to place his hands on his grandsons and give them a special blessing. He told Joseph, "These 2 boys are mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours, but these 2 will be counted as my own sons." Joseph was honored that his father wanted to bless his sons in such a special way. He brought Manasseh, the older son, and Ephraim, the younger, to Jacob. He placed Manasseh on Jacob's right hand and Ephraim on his left, knowing that the right hand symbolized the greater blessing for the firstborn. But as Jacob reached out to bless them, he crossed his arms, placing his right hand on Ephraim, the younger son, and his left hand on Manasseh, the older. Joseph was surprised and tried to correct his father. "No, my father, this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head," Joseph said. But Jacob refused. "I know, my son, I know," Jacob replied. "Manasseh will also become a great people, but his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." Jacob then blessed both boys, saying, "May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." With that, Jacob gave a special inheritance to Joseph's sons, making them equal with his own sons in the family line. Jacob's blessing on Ephraim and Manasseh would continue to be remembered by the people of Israel for generations. Even though Jacob was nearing the end of his life, he wanted to leave behind blessings of hope, peace, and prosperity for his family's future. As Jacob's time on earth drew near, he called all of his sons together to bless them. Each son would receive a special blessing that would shape their future and the future of their descendants. Jacob sat up in his bed, surrounded by his sons, and began to speak, starting with Reuben, his firstborn. Jacob looked at Reuben and said, "You are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength. But you are as unstable as water, and you will no longer excel because you defiled your father's bed." This was a difficult blessing for Reuben, but it showed that actions have consequences. Jacob moved on to Simeon and Levi, saying, "Your swords are weapons of violence. I will scatter you in Jacob and disperse you in Israel." Next, Jacob turned to Judah, and his blessing was much more hopeful. "Judah, your brothers will praise you, and your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." This blessing showed that a great ruler, a future king, would come from Judah's line. Jacob continued to bless each of his sons, speaking words that would guide their lives and the future of their tribes. He spoke of Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. Each blessing was unique, reflecting the character and destiny of each son. Jacob's blessings were a mix of warnings, promises, and hope, reminding his sons of the importance of following God's ways. When Jacob came to Joseph, he gave him a special and heartfelt blessing. Joseph, who had been through so much hardship, was now a great ruler in Egypt and had saved his family from famine. Jacob's love for Joseph was clear as he spoke words of blessing over his beloved son. He praised Joseph for his strength and faithfulness, saying, "Joseph is a fruitful vine, a vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall." Jacob remembered how Joseph had faced many trials, but God had been with him through it all. With bitterness, archers attacked him, they shot at him with hostility. But his bow remained steady, his strong arms stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob. Because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel. Jacob acknowledged that God had given Joseph strength and wisdom in the midst of great challenges. Jacob also spoke of the blessings Joseph would receive in the future. "Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers." Jacob's words showed that Joseph would continue to prosper and be a leader among his brothers. This special blessing was a reminder of God's favor on Joseph's life. Though Joseph had been mistreated by his brothers and sold into slavery, God had raised him up to a position of great power. Joseph's story was one of redemption, and his father's blessing confirmed that God's hand had been on him from the beginning. After blessing all of his sons, Jacob had one final request. He called Joseph to his side and reminded him of the promise he had made earlier. "I am about to be gathered to my people," Jacob said. "Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in Canaan. This is where Abraham and Sarah were buried, where Isaac and Rebekah were buried, and where I buried Leah." Jacob's heart was set on being buried in the land of Canaan, the land God had promised to his family. Even though he had spent the last years of his life in Egypt, Jacob's faith was in God's promises for the future of his descendants. He wanted to rest in the same place as his ancestors. Trusting that one day, his family would return to the land God had promised them, Joseph assured his father that he would honor his wishes. He promised to take Jacob's body back to Canaan and bury him with his ancestors. Jacob was at peace, knowing that his final request would be fulfilled. With that, Jacob breathed his last breath and was gathered to his people, his journey on earth complete. Joseph wept over his father, mourning the loss of the man who had guided him through life. Though Jacob was gone, Joseph's heart was filled with gratitude for the life his father had lived and the faith he had passed down to his family. The time had come to honor Jacob's final wish and carry him back to the land of Canaan. After Jacob passed away, Joseph went to Pharaoh and asked for permission to take his father's body back to Canaan. "My father made me swear an oath," Joseph said, "telling me to bury him in the land of Canaan, where his ancestors are buried. Please let me go and fulfill my promise, and I will return to Egypt." Pharaoh, who respected Joseph greatly, granted his request and allowed him to go. Joseph organized a grand funeral procession for his father. It was a long journey to Canaan, and Joseph wanted to honor Jacob in the best way possible. All of Pharaoh's officials, the elders of Egypt, and Joseph's own household, including his brothers, traveled with him. Even chariots and horsemen were sent along. Making the procession very large and impressive, when they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan River, they stopped to mourn. They held a great and solemn ceremony for Jacob, mourning him for 7 days. The local Canaanites saw the procession and the mourning and were amazed. They said, "This is a solemn occasion of mourning for the Egyptians," and they named the place Abel Mizraim, meaning mourning of the Egyptians. After the mourning period was over, Joseph and his brothers carried Jacob's body to the cave of Machpelah in the land of Canaan. They laid him to rest beside his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Leah, just as Jacob had requested. Once the burial was complete, Joseph and his brothers returned to Egypt, knowing they had honored their father's final wish. After the funeral, Joseph and his brothers returned to Egypt. Though they had honored their father's wishes, a new concern arose among them. They started to worry about what would happen now that Jacob was no longer alive. They remembered how they had treated Joseph years ago and feared that he might seek revenge for their past actions. The brothers approached Joseph with heavy hearts. They said, "Now that our father is gone, perhaps Joseph will hold a grudge against us and pay us back for all the wrongs we did to him." They were anxious and afraid that Joseph might retaliate for the way they had sold him into slavery. They sent a message to Joseph, asking him to forgive their sins. When Joseph received their message, he was deeply saddened. He went to see his brothers and spoke to them kindly. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph's words reassured his brothers, and they were comforted by his forgiveness and kindness. Joseph continued to care for his family, providing them with food and ensuring their well-being in Egypt. He wanted them to know that despite the difficult past, his heart was full of love and forgiveness. Joseph's actions showed his brothers that true reconciliation had been achieved, and they could now live in peace together. During the years that followed, Joseph continued to rise in power and prosperity in Egypt. His role as the ruler of Egypt gave him the authority to oversee the land and manage the country's affairs, especially during the ongoing years of famine. Joseph's wisdom and leadership were respected by everyone, and Egypt flourished under his guidance. Joseph's family, living in the land of Goshen, was well cared for. They prospered and grew in number, just as God had promised. The land of Goshen was fertile and suitable for farming, so Joseph's family had everything they needed to thrive. They were blessed with abundance and enjoyed a good life in Egypt. As Joseph grew older, he knew that his time as ruler would eventually come to an end. He wanted to ensure that his family would continue to be cared for after his death. Joseph made a special promise to his family. He told them, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Joseph made his family swear an oath, saying, "When God comes to your aid, you must carry my bones up from this place." He wanted his remains to be taken to the land of Canaan, just as his father Jacob's had been. Joseph's faith in God's promises was unwavering, and he wanted to be a part of the journey back to the land God had promised to his family. Years passed, and Joseph's life drew to a close. As he approached the end of his days, he called for his family to gather around him one last time. Joseph wanted to share his final words and reaffirm his trust in God's promises. He spoke to his brothers and their children, reminding them of the future God had planned for them. Joseph told his family, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." He reminded them of the covenant God had made with their ancestors and reassured them that God would be with them in the future. His words were filled with faith and hope. After sharing his final instructions, Joseph passed away at the age of 110. His death was a great loss to his family, but they remembered his legacy with gratitude. The Egyptians mourned Joseph's passing, and his leadership and wisdom were honored throughout the land. Joseph's family took care to fulfill his final request. They embalmed his body and placed it in a coffin in Egypt. Although Joseph was gone, his faith and his legacy lived on. The promise he had made to his family, to carry his bones back to the land of Canaan, would be remembered by future generations. After Joseph's death, the Israelites continued to live in Egypt. They remained in the land of Goshen, where they were blessed and prospered. However, as time went on, a new king, or Pharaoh, came to power in Egypt. This new Pharaoh did not know Joseph and did not remember the favors Joseph had done for the Egyptians. The new Pharaoh became fearful of the growing number of Israelites. He worried that they might become too powerful and could potentially join Egypt's enemies in times of war. To prevent this, Pharaoh decided to make the Israelites slaves. He forced them into hard labor, making their lives difficult and harsh. Despite their suffering, the Israelites continued to multiply and grow in number. Their hardship led them to cry out to God for help. They remembered the promises God had made to their ancestors and prayed for deliverance from their slavery. God heard their cries and remembered the covenant he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God decided it was time to act and deliver his people from their suffering. He chose a special leader to guide them out of Egypt and into the land he had promised. This leader would be someone who would help fulfill the promises God had made to Abraham and his descendants. The story of deliverance was about to begin, setting the stage for a new chapter in the history of the Israelites.